The sun has risen across this empty stretch of the Atlantic Ocean. Was it always so? Was it always empty? There are myths and legends and even writings by the Greek philosopher Plato that suggest that at some point in the Earth's distant past, the sun did not rise across a vast empty ocean, but instead spread its golden morning light on a land that was equally called Atlantis.
Did Atlantis really exist? Was it destroyed in a cataclysm of volcanoes and floods? That's the biggest question of all.
Our journey begins here in the Bahamas, where a nearby discovery brings the legend of Atlantis closer to reality. And that's exactly where we're headed, to examine for ourselves the first positive proof of the existence of Atlantis.
So, what exactly was Atlantis? The best description comes from one of the world's best writers, Plato. In 2 of his books, he wrote about a civilization that was, in a word, perfect.
Atlantis was a sophisticated civilization that existed about, in modern terms, 9600 BC.
For Plato, Atlantis was, as he describes it, a holy island. This was a perfect civilization.
It was the best and the brightest of Earth at that time. It was certainly an advanced civilization. The way I envision Atlantis is quite as Plato described it. Something of an Eden on Earth.
It's filled with exotic animals. He describes elephants, for example, in particular. Abundant elephants were on Atlantis.
It's a very prosperous civilization with hot and cold running springs and every conceivable kind of fruit and vegetable growing there. So it was very close to being a perfect place to live.
Plato wrote of an island empire on the other side of the ocean, which he described as having a huge plain, as having a city placed at the centre of that plain, but on the southerly part, and that it was surrounded on 3 sides, to the north, to the west, and to the east, by mountain ranges.
And they took this plain, and then they built a great city in it. And they built a series of concentric canals. And these canals ultimately led from the ocean until you finally reached an inner city that was the great capital of Atlantis, where the big buildings were and great pillars.
And they built these enormous temples, one of which was described as being 1.5 miles on one side, with gold statues. They had silver.
The palace was covered in gold and in ivory and in silver and other kinds of rare and exotic stones.
While Plato's description of Atlantis is very specific, the really big question hasn't been quite so easy to answer: the actual location of Atlantis.
Plato gave various clues, as he said that they used Atlantis to reach what he describes as the opposite continent.
While Plato may not have revealed the exact location of the seafaring nation, he was very specific about the fate of Atlantis.
According to Plato, Atlantis sank in a catastrophic event.
The story of Atlantis is a story of an ideal civilization that lost its way.
They got wayward. They started to be debased, if you will. They tried to conquer other places.
They became decadent, they became arrogant in themselves, and this was part of their downfall.
So Plato said that the gods brought this cataclysm upon Atlantis to punish that civilization for its rapacious ways.
While we may not believe that the destruction of Atlantis was brought about as punishment from the gods, the devastation caused by earthquakes, volcanoes, and tidal waves resulted in the disappearance of the Atlantean civilization from the face of the earth.
As you've heard, Atlantis was destroyed in a cataclysm of earthquakes and tidal waves. But we all know that even when natural disasters occur in underdeveloped countries, there are inevitably survivors. So it is impossible to believe that such a highly developed civilization as Atlantis would simply vanish without a trace.
Now that raises an amazing but totally possible theory. What if Atlantis was not completely destroyed? Maybe somewhere on Earth, the core of the lost continent still exists. And its survivors aren't really lost, they just don't want to be found.
That is the idea behind the new animated feature, Atlantis, The Lost Empire.
And that idea is just the beginning of an incredible adventure. Let's go.
Atlantis is waiting.
Atlantis. Few words can conjure up such an aura of mystery and adventure. Hi, I'm Michael J. Fox, and I play Milo James Thatch in the new movie Atlantis, The Lost Empire. Were Atlanteans a highly advanced race? Or their cities magnificent wonders of crystal and gold? Scholars, archaeologists, and historians have tried for centuries to unearth the ruins of Atlantis, but it took a team of amazing artists to make our Atlantis come alive.
Looks like all our chances for survival rest with you, Mr. Thatch.
You do swim, do you not?
Oh, I swim pretty pretty good.
I know what you seek.
If these outsiders can unlock the secrets of our past, perhaps we can save our future.
Stay tuned, because later on I'm going to take you on an exclusive behind-the-scenes tour of Disney's new animated film, Atlantis, The Lost Empire.
Atlantis is waiting.
Coming up, the first stop on our voyage to reveal the true location of Atlantis, the Lost Empire.
A continent somewhere in the mid-Atlantic that was suddenly struck by some cataclysmic event that sank it beneath the sea. Gentlemen, I propose that we find Atlantis and bring it back to the surface.
Battle stations!
Launch subpods. I know what you seek.
Ever since Plato first wrote of Atlantis, explorers have been combing the Earth in search of the lost continent. Their journey has taken them from mountaintops to ocean bottoms. And while our expeditions may not have actually discovered Atlantis, they have uncovered amazing proof of its existence.
Plato said the island of Atlantis was reached in ancient times by voyagers, mariners from his own world. And he said that they used Atlantis to reach what he describes as the opposite continent. So is it possible that he is suggesting that it wasn't far from the Americas?
Now, how did Plato know to place Atlantis in front of this opposite continent, since he was writing 2,000 years before the Americas were supposedly discovered by Columbus?
To think that there was an advanced civilization that had the ability to navigate the oceans and then vanished is not that out of the ordinary.
People that are alleged to have been part of the Atlantis civilization were considered to be reasonably well advanced, even by today's standards.
We have evidence of sea travel 10,000 years ago in some locations in the Mediterranean.
Were there transatlantic voyages long before historians have led us to believe? Proving that is the first step to proving the existence of Atlantis and compelling evidence is found on both sides of the Atlantic.
We can follow the shadow of Atlantis, shall we say, around the world. And some of that evidence is within megalithic buildings.
We know for a certainty that there were pyramids, of course, on both sides of the ocean that were very similar.
When you go and you see ancient Egypt or the massive monuments in Peru or Mexico, they're awe-inspiring. They're building out of giant blocks of stone.
One of the similarities is they were built without any mortar in between the bricks.
There's a type of construction known as keystone cuts. Keystone cuts is a very unusual way of fitting giant blocks together, where each block has got an hourglass or a T-shaped cut in it on each side of the block, and then metal is poured into both sides of these clamps. We find it, curiously, all over the world.
Also, the alignment, you know, the pyramids are aligned astronomically. How much do these people on both sides of the ocean know about astronomy? Apparently a great deal.
What's one of the things that is critical to navigation? The path of the stars. It's the way seafarers have, for thousands of years, been able to navigate their way across the oceans.
There was a Roman terracotta head that's almost 2,000 years old, found in controlled excavation in the 1930s near Mexico City. How did it get there? This seems to be hard evidence that someone was crossing the Atlantic long before Columbus.
On both sides of the Atlantic, there are very unusual rituals and customs that aren't easily explained. Mummification is another custom that we find in both Egypt, in South America, and in Central America.
While the similarities in mummification on both sides of the Atlantic are striking, what points more conclusively to transatlantic crossing is what was found in the mummies of Egypt. DNA testing has discovered they contain traces of nicotine and cocaine, yet coca and tobacco plants were known only to exist in the Americas.
One of the clues to Atlantis, too, is the similarity of writings that are found all over the world. Everything from hieroglyphs, and how many of the hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt, also in Mexico, were very, very similar for the same thing.
Hieroglyphs have proved conclusively.
There are thousands of books about Atlantis, but virtually all of them were written in the last 100 years. Now, if this incredible lost continent really existed, wouldn't you think there'd be more of a record in the books of ancient history?
Throughout history, knowledge has been destroyed. First, we have to realize that back then there weren't printing presses. Every book was hand-copied.
Another reason why we don't have so much preserved from the ancient world is that they wrote on papyrus, mainly. Papyrus in most parts of the Mediterranean world doesn't survive very well at all.
You know, unless it's in a peat bog somewhere or it's perfectly preserved, it's one of those things that just isn't going to hold up in the archaeological record. I mean, we're lucky if we find stone tools from the last ice age.
There were great libraries in the ancient times, but all of them have been destroyed. The library at Alexandria in Egypt, which had hundreds of thousands of volumes of books, no doubt many of them on Atlantis. That library was destroyed not once, but twice.
The library at Alexandria, the fires there was a tremendous loss to human history. There were rooms there that were dedicated to Homer, and now we only have the Odyssey and the Iliad. There was also books of the Old Testament that were forever lost.
Another reason for the absence of ancient written history is the human history of conquest.
When you destroy a society, the first thing you do is you destroy its books.
The history of the world is one of invasion and counter-invasion, of armies sweeping into countries and destroying the culture, trying to make history start over with them. And they do that by destroying all the libraries, burning all the books. In Mexico, when the Spanish conquered, they found thousands of Mayan books, codex books, and they were all destroyed. Only 4 Mayan codexes are known today. It's no wonder that what knowledge we have is very little of the ancient past. It has been purposely destroyed in most cases.
Just to put this in a modern context, how many of you at home saw the first Super Bowl on television? Well, you're lucky, because it'll never be seen again. Even though it was carried live on 2 networks, a complete videotape of one of the most important events in the history of sports no longer exists. It was accidentally erased by both networks. And that was only 34 years ago.
Okay, Atlantis is at the most a sunken continent, but at the very least, a sunken city. A really, really big city. So, what can be so hard about finding a city?
In academia, they talk of the A word being Atlantis, something which scholars should avoid completely, and that there are just so many different theories and ideas that to get caught up in this world of Atlantis, Atlantology, is almost the death knell on any kind of academic backing that you have.
Atlantis is not in the realm of science right now.
Unless there's treasure associated with it, a treasure of the sort that you can put in the bank, it's very difficult to raise money to support a dream.
Even if you do find someone to fund your research, the challenges in underwater archaeology are extraordinary.
It's very gear intensive. You know, if you can imagine what you'd need as a terrestrial archaeologist, multiply it by 10, and that's what underwater archaeologists are faced with.
The problem of finding pre-dynastic civilizations was very, very difficult. What you're looking for has been there for thousands of years, subject to decay, covered with natural sediment. It makes something like finding the Titanic almost look trivial, where you had fairly good coordinates as to where it was. You know exactly what you're looking for, you know how big it is, you know what to expect, yet it took a long time to find that.
Well, looking for shipwrecks, or for the Titanic, for example, you can use remote sensing equipment like a magnetometer that picks up metals that are associated with these kinds of sites. Well, when you're looking for an Ice Age site, they're not going to have metals. Pretty much you can expect to be left with stone and possibly bone, if you're lucky.
Until recently, we haven't had the technology that would allow us to find a site like Atlantis. That, however, is beginning to change.
It's only in recent times that we've had the technology to be able to scope out these areas and begin to answer, for the first time, some of these compelling mysteries.
And a huge, important piece of the puzzle is still hidden away under the waters, and I think we're going to be in for a surprise.
Fact is, it's now possible. So stand by. The best is yet to be.
When we come back, the hidden secrets of an ancient tomb bring us one step closer to revealing the true location of Atlantis, the Lost Empire.
10,000 years before the Egyptians built the pyramids, Atlantis had electricity, advanced medicine, even the power of flight. Impossible, you say. Well, no, not for them. We're gonna rescue the princess. We're gonna save Atlantis. Or we're gonna die trying. Now let's do it!
Almost every story about Atlantis talks about a civilization over 10,000 years old, but with powers and inventions that seem like they're right out of the 20th century. Sound unbelievable? Take a look at some of the discoveries that explorers have found from ancient times, and you might change your mind.
Often the way we construct the past is the way we perceive the past and ancient peoples to be. We naturally think of them as primitive people who don't have the wheel, don't have electricity. Archaeologists have now proven that that is largely wrong.
There's considerable debate about just how advanced the civilizations that are alleged to be Atlantis may have been. But, you know, there is ample evidence that people were not dumb.
Many of the elements in the Atlantis story, for example, reminds one of Egyptian civilization.
Technologically, I think among the most outstanding aspects of it is they were moving these large multi-ton blocks, systematically stacking them to form the pyramids.
These giant blocks of stone are so huge, even modern cranes couldn't lift those stones. And engineers really have no explanation on how they were moved.
Not only did the ancients build these remarkable structures, they also outfitted them with some very modern conveniences.
They found plumbing, if you will. I mean, you know, and this is 1500 BC we're talking about here.
Hot and cold water flowing for their convenience. In some cases, apparently what were flushing toilets.
Wooden toilet seats, you know, touches out of Martha Stewart.
perhaps even more amazing, is evidence of one of the most modern inventions, electricity.
What they found in ancient Iraq were common bronze or copper articles that had been electroplated with gold.
If they were doing that, they had to have some way to generate an electric current. And that brings us to a very interesting item, sometimes known as the Baghdad battery, which was found some years ago in Iraq. And it's this little jar which has a copper cylinder in it and an iron rod. Turns out when you make a model of it, fill it with vinegar or some kind of other weak acid, it actually generates an electric current.
There are reliefs at the Hathor Temple in Dendera in Egypt which appear to be electric lights and batteries.
Another surprising piece of evidence that points to ancient electricity is that in the darkest recesses of the pyramid's tombs, there is no proof of illumination by torches.
There's no carbon on the walls. Yet, intricate hieroglyphs are painted on the ceilings and on the walls, but there is no evidence of any kind of a flame. Egyptologists are at a loss to explain this.
Historians and scientists are also at a loss to explain this next incredible discovery.
On Easter in 1900, sponge divers off a small island in the Aegean called Antikythera went to a shipwreck and pulled a small metal box out of it.
And in fact, it's been vindicated as absolutely being from over 2,000 years ago.
American scientists studying this box decided it was a computer.
What it was probably doing was computing planetary positions, lunar positions, solar positions, phases of the moon.
It was a navigation device. It's far more complicated than any Swiss clock. It was the kind of device that modern archaeologists were so amazed by what they found. They said that finding this device was like finding a jet airplane in the tomb of King Tut.
Even the idea of a jet airplane in King Tut's tomb isn't that far-fetched when you consider the petroglyphs of South America. Why would the ancients have created something only visible from the air, unless they were capable of some form of flight?
Well, I think ultimately what we're going to find is that the skin-clad, stone tool-wielding caveman idea of the last ice age is totally incorrect.
Normally when Disney's producers and directors research an upcoming film, they travel to the location where the story actually took place. But how do you research the writing, the language, the architecture of a city that is believed to be lost beneath the sea?
Welcome to the city of Atlantis.
Now, if Atlantis was the center of the world's seafaring trade, every aspect of their life would reflect that international influence.
The legends go that from Atlantis sprang all the other cultures around the world. So we started looking at architecture from Egypt and Angkor Wat and Mayan temples.
We took all these cultures and tried to create a new style. We're trying to convince the audience that this was the original style and all the other cultures were influenced by it.
There's certain things that you can only do through animation. It's a magic that can only be realized by animators. And this is a perfect example of it. You could have $1 billion budget and all the science in the world, and you couldn't do what this movie does.
In addition to the international look of Atlantis, would be the international sound.
Luego nos pridos es esanen.
Ida sum amice viator.
This is linguam Romae.
Parlez-vous français?
Oui, monsieur.
They worked out this whole language, and it's based on Latin and other stuff.
My name is Kiragakash.
Kiramashnaga. Hey, you got a nickname? I barely know English.
But whether Atlantis was the root of all civilizations or not, one thing is for sure, the story of Atlantis is just as popular now as it ever was.
Legends endure their dreams, their fantasies, and people love that.
I've always loved fantasy and myth where anything is possible, you know, kind of larger-than-life stuff that doesn't compute.
People want to believe in that sort of thing. It's a big universe. Big, big universe.
So we've seen what the movies think Atlantis will look like when it's found. But what will the lost continent really be like? You'll find out when we go back to sea
on the Voyage to Atlantis, Lost Empire.
In Disney's new movie, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, I play Milo James Thatch. He dreams of discovering the lost empire of Atlantis.
It's in Iceland! I'm sure of it this time!
Joining Milo on his quest is a highly trained team of specialists, led by the rugged Captain Rourke.
Welcome to the club, son.
His second in command, Helga Sinclair.
Battle stations!
Dr. Sweet, the medical officer.
Here, I'm gonna need you to fill these up.
A demolition specialist named Vinny Santorini.
Hey, look, I made a bridge.
Team geologist and dirt connoisseur Gaetan Moliere. Communications expert Wilhelmina Packard.
Can we go home now?
Chief mechanic Audrey Ramirez. And a cook named Cookie.
You like it? We'll have some more.
Will Milo's expedition survive the dangers that await them? Well, I can't give you all the answers because I'd spoil the movie, but I can tell you that it's an epic adventure that'll blow you away.
Now things are getting good.
I'm so excited.
So while the experts have pretty much agreed on what Atlantis was like, the really big question hasn't been quite so easy to answer. Where is it now? Every new book seems to have a new theory. But which one really makes sense?
Atlantis has been placed all over the world. Some of the top places for Atlantis and locations are the Azores in the mid-Atlantic.
Ignatius Donnelly, in his book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, boosted the mid-Atlantic theory, and he boosted it big time.
Ignatius Donnelly was a wonderful old humbug, and facts never bothered him at all.
And he was talking about the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which had sunk Atlantis. Well, if you look at the science, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is actually building land up right now. It's not sinking. It's going in the wrong direction.
He simply created an island and then drew a map of it in his book. And so if Donnelly said so, people were more than willing to believe that it existed. As it turns out, there is nothing there.
Another very strange sunken city, or sunken ruins that have been found, is in the island of Yonaguni of southern Japan.
Visually, this was one of the most incredible places I've ever seen. There were these large steps and this imposing structure in front of me. It appeared as though there could have been a harbor there that boats could have pulled up and moored.
When you're searching for Atlantis, part of that search is for an underwater city. You're looking for ruins underwater. Now they're finding massive granite blocks. They appear to be artificial. They're definitely underwater. They weren't carved underwater. They're probably over 10,000 years old. This is the kind of thing that people looking for Atlantis are looking for.
It's a really fascinating, incredible place. But there's nothing to support it as Plato's Atlantis.
This sunken city of Yonaguni doesn't really fit with the Atlantis model very well. It's very, very far away.
The Atlantic has been the Atlantic since at least 450 BC. The South China Sea is quite clearly in the Pacific. There is no logical or scholarly basis to place it in this position.
One popular location for Atlantis has been the Greek island of Santorini or Thera, an island that literally blew up.
It fits in some ways in the sense that it was destroyed in a single catastrophic event.
On Santorini, as the island is now known, there were remnants of the Minoan civilization. They were extraordinarily advanced, they were artistically creative, and there were many anthropologists, archaeologists, mythologists who tried to take the information about the Minoan civilization and say, this is what Plato was talking about.
There's a lot of problems with Thera being Atlantis, I think.
It was 900 years as opposed to 9,000 years before Plato. It also is not outside the Pillars of Hercules, which most people believe were the Straits of Gibraltar.
This is, again, one of these stories by people who say, well, Plato said certain things. We will accept those things that work with our theory, and we'll dismiss those things that don't work with our theory, and therefore we will have Plato proving that Atlantis was wherever we said it is.
You've heard most of the top theories of where Atlantis is, and we've pretty much blown them all out of the water. Right now, it's time to get into the water because we've reached our destination, the location of an amazing discovery, and the beginning of our theory of where Atlantis really lies.
Edgar Cayce was a 19th century American psychic.
In one of Edgar Cayce's readings, he had predicted that Atlantis would begin rising in 1968 or 1969.
And he was also very specific about where. And he's the one who said it would arrive in Bimini.
Coincidentally, in 1968, the Florida archaeologist was going to the island of Bimini and saw from an airplane underwater what is now known as the Bimini Road. And from that date on, the Bimini Road has become famous and associated with Atlantis.
Since its discovery beneath the shallow water, the Bimini Road has sparked intense debate. Some believe it is not a road, but a dock. Others who have dived the site claim that the stones are actually set on top of other smaller stones buried beneath the sand. To them, this suggests a temple or Stonehenge-like structure. Others claim that the Bimini Road is not a man-made artifact at all.
What happens often is the seabed splits across regular fault lines. And when people see these things, they say, see, this proves that there must have been a city here, and these are the streets of the city.
This cube here is a piece of pyrite. This is 100% naturally formed. So with regard to the Bimini Road, just because it looks artificial doesn't necessarily mean that it is.
The Bimini Road is not the only controversial discovery on the island. From the air, large land formations bear a striking resemblance to ancient petroglyphs found in South America, such as this image of a shark and this of a seahorse.
To be honest, there is no firm solution as to what these early structures are. The geologists will hold that they're natural. The Atlantologists hold that they are archaeological features. And in a way, I believe that they are not that important. The importance is that it drew others to start looking in the area of the Bahamas and the Caribbean.
Now, why would the Caribbean be the most likely location for the seafaring people of Atlantis?
If you leave the Mediterranean and enter the Atlantic, you are immediately pulled into this huge, great circular current which flows in a clockwise direction.
An island continent of Atlantis and the Caribbean would be in an ideal situation to take advantage of these currents, and just as Columbus and other seafarers did, to naturally use them for seafaring. Coming and going to Mexico, to North America, to South America, to Africa, to Europe, to the Mediterranean.
We've seen evidence of an ancient civilization crossing the Atlantic, and signs of their existing in the islands of the Caribbean Sea. When we come back, we'll reveal what we believe is the true location of Atlantis, and give you a ringside seat for its destruction.
I sought to use the crystal as a weapon of war. But its power proved too great to control. It overwhelmed us and led to our destruction.
The world has just entered a new millennium. An appropriate time, I think, to solve one of its oldest mysteries. Where was Atlantis? And what awesome force caused its destruction? It's an incredible story. So find a comfortable spot on the edge of your seat as we head back 12,000 years to a moment that would forever change life on this planet.
Sometime around 12,000 years ago, a comet appeared in the skies over the northwest of the United States. It was heading in a southeasterly direction. It would appear to have fragmented as it appeared to go low level right across the country, like some huge millennial fireworks. And each piece would appear to have impacted with mostly the terrain of the eastern states.
Evidence of this cometary impact can be seen in the thousands of craters known as the Carolina Bays. Additional evidence can be found in the legends of the Native and Central American Indians.
They talk about the appearance of a fiery serpent in the sky, causing mass devastation, causing floods that immediately drowned the islands.
You've got a cataclysm by the ocean. You've got a flood. I definitely think a flood was part of the wiping out of Atlantis.
Almost immediately, it would have caused tidal waves, which would have completely flooded all of the islands.
Not only would flooding by water be devastating, but we're talking rising oceans, so salt water, which nothing would survive.
Plato's account of Atlantis is interesting because there are certain features of it that seem to tie into what we know as events that did actually occur around the end of the last ice age. We do know that there was a sudden environmental change. There was a dramatic change from the ice age to modern warmer conditions. And there was flooding. There were cataclysmic floods in a variety of locations across the globe. There was a massive extinction going on in the Americas. So we do have evidence of some kind of a global catastrophe going on.
What happened as the ice age ended is that global temperatures rose, major glaciers melted, sea levels rose several hundred feet. This flooded many coastal areas around the world.
You can imagine an El Nino event times a million. I think the events that transpired at the end of the last ice age are part of the universal flood myth.
The massive floodwaters covered all but the mountaintops of Atlantis, destroying all life caught in its devastating path. The ocean would eventually begin to recede, but never completely. The Ice Age glaciers melted by the cataclysm had permanently raised the level of the Earth's seas over 300 feet, the height of a 30-story building. Gone forever beneath the waves was the city of Atlantis. Gone forever was the lush, fertile plain. And when the water subsided, what remained of Atlantis is what remains today. Cuba. No other island in the Atlantic fits Plato's description of Atlantis so completely. The mountain ranges that block the cold winds from the north, protecting the vast plain now known to be covered by the southern bay. This is the island that Columbus's voyages brought him to. Just as the mariners of ancient times were carried from the Mediterranean's Pillars of Hercules by the southerly trade winds and returned home by the northerly Gulf Stream. The lost continent of Atlantis.